Cool. All right, everyone. I'm sorry I was a little bit late. I am in London and I had to run to my brother's house to do the presentation, and there was a really bad accident. So we thank God for his traveling mercies and in getting me back safely.
No,
even though
we're
a
happy
little bit late.
with
So
us.
apologies for my lateness. I got a little bit teary in the car, panicking, but I'm all good now. So
Nothing to worry. Thank you, Naomi.
hello, everyone. It's really lovely to be with you again. As Diane said, I taught the physical fitness honor. Feels like forever ago, but I think it was only in March, April time. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build on that honor a little bit with the bones, muscle, and movement honor. And the badge looks like this. So before we get into that too much, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview as to who I am. So I'm a youth leader and leadership advisor within the South England Conference, but I'm also a massive sports fan. I've studied sport at university, and I've done a master's degree as well in sports psychology. So that's really my love. And I am marrying an athlete as well, so sport's very much part of our lives. But also I was a Pathfinder, so I went to Oshkosh in 2009 and absolutely loved my time as a Pathfinder. So it's really lovely to be able to meet with some more Pathfinders from around the world today, and to share a little bit about anatomy, which is going to be our subject for today.
Hey, Naomi.
Oh yeah, hello.
Just a small reminder for everybody who is watching this on the Facebook Live at the moment. If it's possible, make sure you hit the like button and share it on your Facebook wall, as that really helps us kind of enlarge the family and spread the good news about these honors. So if that's not a big deal for you, make sure you hit the like button and then share it. Naomi,
yes,
also, just want to point out, Naomi is somebody who was also youth leader here in Stamford Park, and she did an amazing job, and we are very proud of you, Naomi. I didn't even know that you're now serving on SEC Youth Advisory. Pastor Anthony, well done, champion. You got the best people. God bless you.
Yes, shout out to Pastor Anthony Fuller. He's definitely a good one. So we love him a lot. So I have experience in bones, muscles, and movement from lots of different angles. So I studied anatomy at university as part of my degree. But as Diane and maybe Natalie as well will tell you, my brother and I, who is here, have a lot of experience in breaking bones and injuring bones. So some of what I'm going to share with you today has come from the lessons that I learned through school and university.
Can I just also interrupt right now?
Yes, Michael, I'd love you to interrupt. Yeah, that'd be great.
Michael is there. Can you please say hello to Michael?
Michael, Diane says hello.
Thank you so much, Zoe.
No problem. He says hi back. So we have a lot of experience in breaking bones and mending them as well. So we're going to talk to you a little bit this morning, or this afternoon even, about bones, muscles, and movement. So let's get started. I promise you there are going to be no gory photos. Sorry for those that were hoping for some gory photos, but there will be some images of skeletons and stuff like that. So there will be nothing too gory for those of you who have a sensitive stomach. And I believe as well that the worksheets were made available to you. So if you've got those printed out or in front of you, now would be the good time to get them ready, because we're going to run through the worksheets in this session today. So the first thing you need to know for this honor is the difference between an exoskeleton and an endoskeleton. And you also need to know what type of skeleton humans have. That's a really easy one to answer. They started us off quite nicely. So the main difference between an endoskeleton and an exoskeleton is that an exoskeleton is a hard shell on the outside of the creature, like a crab or a lobster. So they have their hard shell on the outside, like a snail, whereas humans, birds, mammals, animals have their skeleton on the inside, like an endoskeleton. So I like to think of it as N for inside. And then I like to think of exoskeleton for exit on the outside. So that's a really easy way, hopefully, to distinguish between the two types of skeleton. So hopefully, if you know that an exoskeleton is on the outside and an endoskeleton is on the inside, then you'll know that humans have an endoskeleton and not an exoskeleton. Okay, so that's the first one. And I'm going to go quite quickly through these slides today, because this honor is quite meaty, for want of a better word. And there's a lot to cover, so we're going to fly through it, and then you can always watch it back in your own time. So 3 functions of the skeletal system. So I've listed 6 here, and you can pick the 3 that you like the most or that you think are the most important, perhaps. So the first function of the skeletal system, and really importantly, it protects our internal organs. Can you imagine what life would be like if we didn't have a skull to protect our brain? It would be quite worrying for many of us. So it's really important that our skeletons and our bones are there to protect our brains, our heart, our lungs, and all our tummy insides, everything like that. So it's really important that our skeleton prevents us from getting damage to our internal organs. The second thing about our skeleton and our bones is that they store and release fat. So fat is a good source of energy, and also fat keeps us warm. So it's important that bones can store some fat and release some fat to keep us warm, but also to give us energy when we haven't eaten enough to give ourselves energy. So that's really important. It's important to note that fats aren't always bad. The third reason why skeletons are really important is that they produce our blood cells. So in our bones, we have things called bone marrow. We have yellow bone marrow, we have red bone marrow, and they produce red blood cells and white blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen around our body, which is obviously really important to keep us alive. But white blood cells are also crucial because they fight off infections and bad things that enter our bodies. So it's really important our skeleton continues to produce blood cells because blood cells also die. So we need a constant supply of new ones. What's also really important about your skeleton is that it stores and releases minerals. Minerals are really important for loads of different things, for bone health, for brain function, for heart function, and they are stored in the bones. So that's another really important reason why we have our skeleton. The most obvious one, perhaps, is that skeletons facilitate movement. So moving your arms up and down, standing up, sitting down, are all possible because of your skeleton working with your muscles to enable you to move. If you didn't have a bone in your finger, you wouldn't be able to move it. So it's really important that we have our bones for movement. And finally, and this is probably the most important, is that skeletons support the body. So if I had no skeleton, I think I would just be a bit like this, a bit like a puppet, because I would have no structure to my body. So skeletons give us structure. They enable us to stand up tall, to move our arms, and to have broad shoulders. If we weren't skeletons, we'd kind of be like blobs on the floor. So it's really important that we have our bones and our skeletons to support the body. Day, I'm conscious I saw a hand up. Are you happy to take questions on my behalf in the chat?
Yes, I can do that, Naomi.
Is that okay?
If you have a question, just put it just put it in the chat room. I think you answered this question already. What are the skeleton's functions, kind of? So you gave a little bit of that. So that, well, not a little bit, a lot. Yes, guys, keep posting questions, and when it comes up, I'll try to find a place in the last, Naomi.
Perfect. Thanks, Diane, so much. Okay, so that's the function of the skeletal system. Remember, you only need 3 points, and it's down to you to pick the 3 that you like most out of the 6 that I've given you today. So this is not a picture of my brother, but it may as well be. Is bone a living tissue? So the third thing you've got to do is say, is bone a living tissue? Yes or no? And if it is, then you've got to explain why. And if it's not, then you've got to explain why. So it'd be interesting.
That's a good question, Naomi. Let us be, people just post in the chat room, and is it bone a living tissue? Yes, no. We can go with that at the moment. You don't have to give us a large answer, but let's just see what other young people are saying, if that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the verdict, Diane?
Oh yeah, the verdict is yes. Yes, it is. Well, they're saying yes, it is. But of course, we will need to hear from you. Yeah, it seems to me they're saying it is a living tissue. Yes, it is.
Okay.
Is that a correct answer, Naomi?
That is correct. It is the correct answer. And it's the correct answer because of 3 reasons, really. The first one is we already discussed, bones produce blood cells. So if bones were not living, they couldn't produce new things, if that makes sense. So bones have to be living because they produce blood cells. Also, bones can grow and bones can heal themselves. So if you were to break your bone, it would, in most cases, heal, which means that it can be a living tissue because it can heal itself. And the third reason is connected to the second one. Bones continually regenerate themselves. So bone cells die and new bone cells are then produced, which means that bones are continually regenerating themselves. So well done to anyone that said yes. because you got that question right. Now, the fourth point that you need to answer on your worksheet is to describe the structure and the development of bone. Diane, just quickly, I've asked to enter the Zoom on my phone so I can see the chat at the same time. So if you wouldn't mind letting me in on my phone, that would be great as well.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all.
Cool. So before we get into the development and the structure of bone, it's interesting. So there's a fun fact. Babies have 300 bones when they're born, but adults have 206. So the fun fact is that the number of bones in our body actually decreases as we grow up, which is really interesting because I think most people would think that your bones would increase. So that's cool. So the structure of bone is, oh, hold on a second, sorry, excuse me.
Naomi, somebody just said, do we lose bone as density as we're getting older? That's a question.
Yeah, and we will come on to that actually. That's a really good point that we're going to discuss. I think it's around question 11 around osteoporosis, because losing bone density is what osteoporosis is. So that's a really important question that we will address later in the presentation. So bone is hard, which is good because then it's hard to break. But thankfully, it's also quite lightweight, which means that we're not having to drag ourselves around all the time, even though sometimes it may feel like we are. Bone is primarily formed of a substance called calcium phosphate. So if anyone's ever told you that you need to eat dairy, you need to eat milk or cheese to grow strong bones, it's because they contain calcium, and calcium is a massive component of our bones and makes our bones strong. So bones are really clever because they have a high compression strength. So even though they're quite light, it takes quite a lot of force to break one. You know, I can't just hit my arm and it will break, which is a good thing. So they're really, you know, God designed them really well, which means they don't break under limited amounts of force and pressure. Bone is somewhat elastic as well, which makes it good for movement, and it also makes it good for flexibility if it were to break. And that's because of a substance called collagen. And we'll come back to collagen later because collagen is really, really important. And finally, what's really important for you to know for this honour is that the density of bone varies at different points in the bone. So you can see in this diagram here, we've got some darker areas and some lighter areas. Excuse me, and in the lighter areas, your bone will be lighter. And in the darker areas, your bone will be more dense. And that aids the growth of your bone, which we'll talk about in a second. So it would be probably quite important for you to have a rough diagram of a bone and be able to label the spongy bone, the periosteum, which is a really important part of the bone. You've got yellow bone marrow in here, which we've talked about as producing blood cells. And then we've got red bone marrow in here as well, which, as we said, produces red blood cells. And there's cartilage around the outside too. So it would be a good idea to draw a picture of a bone like this and just label some of the key components. As you can see here, in long bones, which are in your arms and your legs, you have two main areas of bone. You have what's called the epiphysis, which are the ends of the bone. So you have an epiphysis on each end. And then you have diaphysis in the middle. So it would be a good idea as well to add those sections to the label of your bone when you draw it on your worksheet. Now, there are two main types of bone. One is called woven bone, which is in this diagram here, and one is called lamellar bone, which is in this diagram here. So woven bone is super clever, and I'm a huge fan of woven bone because it's used for growth and repair. So when we're younger, we have lots of woven sections of bone because they are what helps us grow. My brother is 6'3", so when he was younger, he would have had a lot of woven bone in his legs to help him grow up super tall. So what happens here is that the fibers in the bone, these spaghetti things, they're random, they're all over the place, you know, they're not aligned, which means that they can shoot out and grab onto things to grow longer. Lamellar bone is the opposite. As you can see, it's much more of a pattern as to where the bone fibers are. And because there's a pattern, lamellar bone is much stronger than woven bone. So you're more likely to see breaks in woven bone. When people are growing, their bones are more likely to break because they have woven bone, not lamellar bone. Once we are older, if you're older like me, older like Diane, if I can say so, then you're more likely to have robust lamellar bone that's less likely to break. So what happens is the woven bone will grow, and then the woven bone will become lamellar bone, and therefore it's less likely to break. That's a really important difference, whatever I'm trying to say, difference to note between two types of bone. Now, bone development is quite a complex process. So I've tried to simplify it as much as possible. But if this is confusing, or if you want more information, I would really encourage you to look online, because there's a wealth of infographics and there's a wealth of videos available to you to help you learn more about bone development. So most bone development occurs in the womb. So as babies are forming in their mum's tummy, that's when most of the bones will form. However, some bones do fuse together after birth, and that's why, like we said earlier, babies have 300 bones when they're born, but 206 bones when they become an adult. So over time, usually around toddlerhood, their bones will fuse together. They'll have fewer bones, and then they grow up into adults. So that's a really important thing to note. So we talked about cartilage, and we said that we would come back to talk about that because it's really important. So bone growth starts in the cartilage. That's why you have cartilage at both ends of the bone in the epiphysis sections of the bone. So the development of bone is otherwise known as ossification. Okay, so long bones, they're called ossify or develop, and get longer as they grow. So the bones grow from the end, the epiphysis. So this middle bit stays the same, and the ends just grow longer. Okay. So if a bone has a growth plate on the end of it, which is also called the epiphyseal line, quite difficult to say, then that shows the bone is still growing. So if the doctor was to x-ray you or examine your bones and see that you had a growth plate or an epiphyseal line, they would know that you're still in the process of growing. If you're like me and you've been 5'7" for 10 years now, and you're definitely not growing any taller, you're probably not going to have a growth plate on the end of your bone, okay, because you're done and dusted with growing. So as I said, in your late teens, early 20s, a person stops growing and all of their cartilage is replaced by solid bone. So no further growth in the ends of the bone is possible. However, it's really important to note that even though the bone can't get longer, it can get thicker. So if you have a training regime, training schedule that includes lots of weight training, like my husband-to-be, you are more likely to have really, really dense bones, really, really strong, thick bones that will support your larger muscles, if that makes sense. So that's a very simplified tour of bone development. As I said, it's a really interesting process. If you want more information than perhaps you need for this honour, go and look online. There are some fantastic YouTube videos around it. So just to go back to the diagram we saw earlier, as we said, there's an epiphysis on the two ends of the bone. So that's where the bone grows out, and the diaphysis stays pretty consistent. It stays pretty constant. It doesn't change with growth. So the diaphysis stays the same, and the epiphysis extends on each end. And as you can see, there's cartilage around the bone here. That's what makes the bone grow out. And here you can see an epiphyseal line, or that growth plate, that signifies whether the bone is still growing or not. So looking at this bone, you can see two epiphyseal lines, which suggests that that person is still in the process of growing. So well done then. Now, we talked about bone marrow in the past within this presentation. I just want to talk about it now because it's a really important part of the structure of bone, okay? So if we go back a slide, you can see that it's here in yellow form and it's up here in red form, okay? So it does take up quite a lot of space in the bone. So bone marrow is really spongy. And it's found towards the center of the bone. So you're not going to have it absolutely on the edges of the bones. It's more towards the middle, because remember, the edges are cartilage that's growing outside. So bone marrow makes, that should be it, bone marrow makes its blood cells. Each type of blood cell made by the bone marrow has an important job. So remember I said that the red blood cells are crucial because they carry oxygen to tissues around the body. And white blood cells are also really crucial because they fight infections. So bone marrow is absolutely critical to our function as humans. Without them, we would die. So it's really important that we know what bone marrow are, that we can explain it, and that we understand why it's important in our bodies. And research has shown that over time, red bone marrow is mostly replaced by yellow bone marrow in large bones. So in my arm bones, in my leg bones, they will be primarily yellow bone marrow. And on the bones that surround my organs, so like my sternum, which is this bone here, the chest bone, or my scapula, my shoulder blades, my ribs, that will have red blood cells in it. So when you're younger, you'll have red and yellow bone marrow in your long bones. As you get older, the yellow bone marrow takes over, and the red bone marrow moves to what's called flat bones, which surround your organs. Now, this is the really fun bit when we get to identify some bones in our body. So here's a list of the bones that the honour asks you to identify. So we've got carpals, clavicle, coccyx, cranium. You can see all of them. I think there were 13. Does that add up? No, that must be more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times 3. I think there's 22 bones that we have to label. So we're going to go through each section of the body and do it all at once. Now, if you have a collection of post-it notes, then you can do it as we go and you can stick them onto yourself. If you have a pen that you're happy to draw on yourself with, then you can do that. I've got mine ready and I can label all my body parts. Otherwise, there's a section in your worksheet that you can use just to write it down. But I always find it easier to draw it on myself and then I remember. So we'll start with the head. That makes sense, right? Start at the top and work down. So the bone that surrounds your skull and protects your brain, sorry, the bone that surrounds your brain and protects it from damage is what's called your cranium. So this whole section, although it's made up of several bones fused together, the whole thing is called your cranium. Then you have two bones, one here and one here. So this is called your maxillary bone and this is called your mandible bone. So your mandible bone is essentially your jawbone. So it helps you eat, helps you talk, basically moves your jaw up and down. So it's a really important bone. If you break it, then usually you have to have your jaw wired shut so that you can keep your jaw really still and the bone can heal, which normally means you have to drink all your food for 6 weeks, which doesn't sound very fun. So your mandible is this bit, your lower part of your jaw, and the maxilla is the front bit around your nose and the front of your face, which, yeah, it just forms the front of your face. Arms. So, move my hair out of the way. What we have is we have what's called our clavicle. And if I move my arm like this, you should be able to see my clavicle. It's also known as your collarbone, because when you do up your collar, it sits nicely on your clavicle. Okay, so you've got two clavicles, one on either side. Then you have your shoulder blades. So if you do that and you give yourself a quick hug, I'm not flexible enough to do it that way. You give yourself a quick hug, you can feel almost like a triangle shaped bone on the backs of your shoulders. And that's what's called your shoulder blade. You won't feel it at the front because you've got ribs at the front, but you'll feel it around the back of your shoulder. So if you just give yourself a knock on your back, that's your scapula. And again, you've got one on either side. The diagram also shows your ribs. Hopefully you know where your ribs are. They're on your torso and they kind of start around where your tummy is and they come all the way up to your clavicle around here. Okay, so there's lots and lots of ribs in that section. Your humerus, which is called your funny bone for obvious reasons, humerus, funny bone, makes sense, is the top bone in your arm, okay? So everything from kind of your shoulder blade down to your elbow is your humerus. So any time that you've kind of been doing something and you've knocked your elbow on the table or knocked your elbow on the door and it hurts and you have to hold it like that, that's called your funny bone. It's called your humerus, okay? Now, if you look at your arm, you've got two bones in your lower arm. So you've got your radius that runs down here, and you've got your ulna that runs down there. So I always remember it as U for under. So your ulna is underneath, and your radius is on the top, and they connect to your humerus at the elbow. You've got one there and then two there. Then we come to the hand. So take my hairband off. We've got carpals in our wrist. So they are where you meet your radius and your ulna. You've got your carpals just at the entrance to the hand. Then you've got your metacarpals. And finally, your fingers are called your phalanges, okay? So carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. So that's your arms. And this is your upper body. So we've talked already about the ribs being in your torso, being in your chest. And your ribs are super important because they protect your lungs, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, your stomach. Loads of stuff is protected by your ribs, as well as just giving you that structure that we talked about in the function of the skeletal system. And the ribs attach to two things. So at the front, they attach to what's called your breastbone, which is scientifically called your sternum. So I like to think of it as when my mum looks stern at me, she looks like this. And she's looking down at me, down her sternum, okay? So that's an easy way to remember your sternum. She's shorter than me now, so maybe I need to change it to my dad when he's stern, looks down at me like that, okay? So that's where your sternum is. It's that bony bit down the middle. If you press on it straight underneath your chin, you'll find. So the front, your ribs connect to your sternum, and at the back, your ribs connect to what's called your vertebrae. So there are loads of vertebrae. You can see each one here is a separate section. There are loads of them that run from the top tip of your neck all the way down to your bottom. So it's a really long column, and each section of vertebrae perform a different function. And the bottom of your vertebrae is something called the coccyx. And your coccyx can be very painful if you land on it, like if you're playing football and you go for a header and then you land on the lower part of your back and it really hurts. That's your coccyx, okay? It's otherwise known as your tailbone. I can never spell it, so well done to anyone that manages to spell it right on their worksheet. And finally, you've got your legs. So you've got the pelvis at the top. So you've got one pelvis, and both legs go into your pelvis, okay? So I recently broke my pelvis, which was not very fun. And your pelvis is what everything latches into. So if you break it, it's not exciting whatsoever. The top part of your leg, so between your pelvis and your knee, is the femur. Now, the fun fact about the femur is that it's the longest bone in your body. So if someone sees your femur, if someone finds a femur, they can use the femur to guess how tall that person was because it is the largest bone in the body. If you break your femur, it's really dangerous, so you've got to be careful. The patella is the fancy word for the kneecap. So you can see it just there in orange. It sits between the femur and the bones of the lower leg, and it protects all the ligaments and the cartilage within your knee that my brother likes to break. And it basically allows you to move your knee freely and movably, but without breaking it, which is really important. Then in your lower leg, you've got a larger bone called the tibia and a smaller bone called the fibula. So if I just demonstrate here, this is my left leg. So my tibia is on this side and my fibula will be on the outside of my leg. So if I was to switch round, the tibia would still be on the inside of my leg and the fibula will be on the outside of my leg. So when I was learning it, I used to say to myself that the fibula is telling fibs, so it's running away. So it's on the outside of the leg. You might think that's lame, but it helped me pass my exams, so that's fine. Now remember in the hand, we had carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Well, it's exactly the same in the leg, except it's T. So you've got tarsals at your ankle, metatarsals in your foot, and phalanges in your toes, okay? So if you are into football, you will know that metatarsals are what the footballers always break. So before every World Cup, an England footballer always breaks his metatarsal, and everybody goes up in arms thinking that our chances of winning the World Cup are over. So I always remember that T is for toe. So T for toe, tarsals, and then I know that C for carpals is in my hand, and I hope that helps you remember which one is which. So that's the skeleton, and while we were talking about that, we talked about our shoulders, we talked about our elbows, we talked about our knees and our ankles. So those are all examples of joints. Now, we need to be able to define what a joint is in this honor. A joint is really simply the place where two or more bones meet. So in the elbow, we've got the humerus meeting the radius and the ulna. So you've got an intersection between three bones. In your finger, you've got an intersection between the phalanges and the metacarpals. So you've got two bones meeting. So it doesn't really matter how many bones are meeting at the joint. We just know that that's a place where bones meet, okay? So in the chat bar, have a think of places where two or more bones meet in the body. Knowing what we've just covered about where all the bones are and what they do, have a think. We talked about shoulder, we talked about elbow, we talked about knee. What other joints can you think of within the body that are really important?
All right. We have a question there for everybody, guys. By the way, Naomi, just to let you know, somebody on the Facebook wrote, "This is the best honor ever." It doesn't happen very often, just to let you know, Naomi. Okay, somebody mentions ankles. Somebody mentions, on the basis of, Naomi, a few bones being together, joining together, there's talking about ribs. Others are talking about wrists.
Yeah.
And some people are using some technical terms that I did not learn in School of English. So I'm not going to try to pronounce it because
okay, we'll skip those ones.
honor can turn from the best to not best honor. So Naomi, you take us further.
Okay, I'll take us on. So yeah, absolutely. Ankles, elbows, shoulders. Ribs is a really good one because ribs, you've got ribs at the front with the sternum and ribs at the back with the vertebrae. So well done to the person that said ribs. You've also got where, remember, the jawbone meets the cranium. That's a really important one because that enables us to move our jaws. It enables me to talk to you. So anywhere in the skeleton where two or more bones meet is a joint. Now, there are three major types of joint between bones, and we need to be able to label them. Well, we need to be able to explain what they are and then label them in the body. So these are the three types of joints. The first is called fibrous, which I always think as being fused together, F for fibrous, F for fused, which essentially is an immovable joint. So remember I said that the cranium in the skull is made up of lots of different bones fused together, okay? You can't move parts of your head independently from other parts of your head, thankfully, otherwise that would be very creepy. So it's really important that the bones that are in your head don't move away from one another, otherwise your head could fall apart and that would just be super weird. Cartilaginous joints are semi-movable. So this is an example of vertebrae. The vertebrae allows me to move backwards, move side to side, but thankfully I can't just pivot 880 degrees like an owl and look behind me. So there's some movement there, but it's not freely movable. It's kind of, kind of controlled, kind of free. It's in the middle. The last one is what's called synovial joints, and synovial joints are freely movable. And these will be the joints that most of us think about when we think about our body, our elbows, our wrists, our hips and knees and ankles. So these are probably the more important ones for this honor because there are also a subsection of synovial joints that we need to know about, okay? So that I think is the next question. Oh my word, look at me. It's almost as if I wrote the slide. So we now need to talk about the 6 types of synovial joints. Remember, synovial means freely movable. So this is an example of a synovial joint. This is the hip joint where the femur fits into the pelvis. So these are the 6 types of synovial joint within the body. First up, we're going to go this way, we're going to go anti-clockwise. You've got a pivot joint. So a pivot joint exists in your neck between what's called your C1 and your C2 vertebrae. So C stands for cranial. Does it, or cervical? Oh dear, I might have to check that. I think it's cervical, but well, I'll check that and let you know. So it allows you to move your neck from side to side and up and down. That's a pivot joint. A hinge joint is in your elbow. A hinge joint is also in your knee. So in your hinge joint, you can move your arms, you can move your knees, generally in one way. You can't really do a huge amount other than go up and down with a hinge joint. A saddle joint is in your ankles, but it's also in your thumbs, okay? So a saddle joint is, you can go around a bit, you can go up and down a bit. A plane joint is between your tarsal bones. And you've got condyloid, I love that word, I don't know why, condyloid joint. And that's between your radius and your wrist. Remember, your radius is here, or here, and then you've got your wrist. So you've got your condyloid joint, and look how much movement I've got there. Loads and loads of movement. If you're a pianist, if you play any kind of instrument, you'll be really glad for your condyloid joints because they enable you to do lots of things with your hands. Finally, my favorite type of joint is probably the most famous one, if joints can be described as such. And that's called a ball and socket joint. So I've got a ball, it's got a socket, and it moves around like that. Okay, so this is my shoulder, as you will probably know, and that is a ball and socket joint. So look how much movement I have with my ball and socket joint. You also have a ball and socket joint in your hip. Remember where I said your femur meets with your pelvis, and you can move your leg up and down, round and round. That's what I broke, not fun. So those are the 6 types of synovial joints. Now, synovial joints, they are a little bit more complex than what we're going to cover in this presentation because I'm really conscious that I've only got 15 minutes left. Go away, have a research about what makes each joint different and write that in your worksheet. What we've just covered is the 6 names and where they are. You need to do a little bit more research about what each one does and how they're different to make sure you get that honor. So this is in the slides as well. You can get this after the presentation and it gives you a bit more of a description as to what each joint does, which I've just told you to research. So I've given you a bit of a head start there. What you also need to do after this session is you need to be creative and construct a model of one of these six synovial joints. So there's an example of one that I found on the internet that you might want to copy, or you might want to be creative and think about what you could do with papier-mâché or balloons or something really fun to construct a model of one of the joints by yourself. Top tip, ball and socket is probably the easiest one to make. Now, this is my specialty, broken bones. So a broken bone is otherwise known as a fracture, and there are 2 main types of fracture. Most fractures are what's called a closed fracture. So you break your arm, but you don't see the bone out of your body. Open fractures are a little bit gory. And when I say a little bit gory, they're very gory because the bone actually comes out of the skin. So you break it so hard that the bone sticks out. And that's a bit gross, okay? So if you want to break your bone, you kind of want it to be a closed fracture. Now, there are a few types of fractures that you need to be aware of. There's transverse, which just goes straight across the bone. Then you've got a stress fracture, which doesn't break the bone into 2 pieces, but it does show a line in the bone that demonstrates that it had damage to it and that it needs rest. So I've had stress fractures in my ankle before. The bone hasn't split, but it has cracked, and essentially it needs to be rested. But displaced is where it literally splits into 2 pieces, like that. And a green stick, as you can see, is just up one side. And then comminuted is a really, really bad one. You've smashed your leg to smithereens. There's loads of pieces left, and it's a dire situation. So those are the different types of fractures. You don't want any of them, let me tell you, but those are the different types you can have if you get a fracture. Now, doctors can help your bones in two ways, really. And the most important thing to note here is that bones, because they're living tissues, like you said, remember you got that answer right, they will constantly regenerate. So if a bone breaks, a bone is pretty good at healing itself. It will replace the broken elements of the bone, it will give itself new cells, and over time it will heal. But there are two ways that doctors can help that process. The first is that they can set the bone. So if you were to break your bone, let me see what I've got here. If you were to break your bone into two pieces, all they have to do is make sure that the bones are aligned so they can grow back together, okay? And the second thing they can do to make sure that the bones heal properly is to wrap the bones in plaster to immobilize them. So most people have known someone who's been in plaster. So what the doctors do before they put it in plaster is they set the bone to make sure that it's aligned so that it can grow back together. But also then they put the plaster around it so you can't move it out of that set position and it grows back together. For most people, for simple fractures, you'll be in a cast for about 6 weeks. But the more complex the break, the longer you can be in a cast. My dad had to have pins put in his ankle because he had a really bad break in his ankle, for example, and had to be in a cast for 3 months, I think. But it's also important to note that some bones don't have to be immobilized when broken. So when my brother broke his nose, it moved from here to here in a rugby game. The doctors they had to set it, which was gross. They had to push the nose back into its position, which, oh my word, sounds disgusting. But you don't put a plaster cast on that bone, okay? So there are some bones when you break them, like your jaw, your nose, your collarbone, that you don't put in plaster, but it is still really important to set it in the right place. Now, well done to whoever asked that question about bone density earlier, because that's what we're going to talk about now. Osteoporosis is the depletion of minerals from the bone. And I'm sorry I'm going quickly, but I've seen the time and we need to go quite fast. So minerals in bone are what gives bone their strength. So if a bone has a low bone mineral density, or BMD, then it's more likely to break even when it's only stressed lightly. So I don't have osteoporosis. So this is my bone. You can't break it. It's really hard. It's really dense. It's really thick. You can't break it. This is an older person's bone, someone who has got low mineral density, can't break it, can't break it, can't break it, and then you can, it did work earlier, there you go, you can snap it in two because it is so low in minerals. So anyone can get osteoporosis. It's really important to note that there are people in their 20s, even in their teens, who have osteoporosis. However, the most common population who get osteoporosis are older women. So my granny might have it and she takes a supplement to try and make sure that her bones stay strong because of the hormones in women combined with the lack of minerals as you get older makes them at risk. Risk factors include being a woman, having dementia, having a history of weak bones and fractures, that's me and my brother, and being of European descent. But there are some things, so those things you can't really change. You're either a woman or you're not, you have dementia or you don't, you're of European descent or you're not. But other factors can be avoided, and it is really important that we make sure that we do avoid getting osteoporosis. So here's just an example of what a normal bone looks like. Look how it's compact. The spots within it are tight together, whereas these spots, the spongy bits, are bigger. So essentially there's more spongy bits and less hard bone, which makes it more susceptible to break. So as you can see here, this is a normal healthy bone. It's got good levels of compact minerals. In this one, the spongy bits are bigger, which means that it's spongy and then it breaks, okay? So that it's really important that we engage in healthy habits to ensure we don't get osteoporosis. So here's 7 examples of ways that we can try to avoid osteoporosis by maintaining healthy bones, but you only need 5. So it's up to you to choose the 5 that you think are most important or the ones you think are most manageable. So firstly, avoid soft drinks. Secondly, avoid alcohol. And thirdly, avoid tobacco. So most of us will avoid alcohol and tobacco anyway, but it's really important that we also take osteoporosis into account while we're doing it. Maintaining a healthy body weight. Now, most people, when they think of maintaining a healthy body weight, think they might have to lose weight. Actually, when it comes to osteoporosis, it's people that have abnormally low body weights that are more susceptible to osteoporosis. Those with smaller bones, with thinner bones, those are the ones, understandably, if you've got thinner bones, they're more likely to break, who are more at risk of osteoporosis. As we said before, remember calcium phosphate is that primary material of bone. So it's really important that we're eating enough calcium, whether it's through dairy or through supplements or other means, to ensure that we have enough calcium to make our bones strong. Calcium is absorbed into the bones by vitamin D. So we need to make sure we're having calcium and vitamin D together to ensure our bones are healthy. And remember we said earlier that even though your bones get to a certain length and then stop growing, that you can make them thicker through weight training. Well, it's really important to do weight training because it makes your bones thicker and therefore can offset osteoporosis. Lots of women don't like doing weight training. I am not one of those women. I love doing weight training. And it's really important that more women, especially more older women, are engaging with weight training. It doesn't have to be in a gym with a plate like this woman in this picture, but just simple weights can really, really help. Now, we've talked about the skeletal system. We're going to move on to the muscular system. The function of the muscular system is simply one word: motion. So muscles facilitate motion, and that motion can either be internal to the body, like my heart beating, that's movement that happens inside my body, right? Or it can be external, moving my arm up and down, walking out of the room, walking back in the room, okay? So muscles facilitate movement. That movement can be internal or external to the body. Now, there are different types of muscle tissue, and I believe we have to know 3 types for this honor. That's right. So 3 types of muscle tissue. The first type is smooth muscle tissue. So if you look at that picture of that muscle fiber, oh, it looks so smooth. The important thing about smooth muscle tissue is that we cannot voluntarily control it. I cannot tell my tummy when to digest food. I cannot tell my kidneys when to absorb water. The Lord has designed us in a way that we don't have to think about that, which thankfully is amazing because I've got too much to think about anyway. That happens all without our control. So that's fantastic. Cardiac muscle tissue is a little bit like smooth muscle tissue in that we can't control it. So thankfully, again, to the Lord, we don't have to think about every time our heart beats. Imagine if we had to every day go, right, I need to beat my heart now, need to beat my heart now, need to beat my heart now. We'd never get anything done because we'd be so preoccupied by keeping ourselves alive. So smooth and cardiac are similar in that they are both under involuntary control. They're not under our conscious control in our minds. But cardiac muscle tissue has a slightly different structure to smooth muscle tissue because the heart is so important and has such a specific function. Then we've got the most, not famous, but I guess the most thought of muscle tissue, which is skeletal muscle tissue. So skeletal muscles are those that are attached to the skeleton and facilitate motion. So your biceps, your triceps, they help me move my arm, flex, lift things, put things down. So skeletal muscle is absolutely under my control. My body doesn't just move my arm without me thinking about it. I had to make it do that, okay? So that's the difference between involuntary control muscles and voluntary control muscles. It's really important that you can name the 3, say which control they're under, and then give an example. So cardiac would be heart, skeletal might be bicep or tricep, and then involuntary could be your liver or your colon or something. Now we also need to know the major muscles of the body, and here's a list of the ones. Thankfully, it's a few fewer than the ones for the skeletal system. Now these are the major muscles we need to know. We've got our deltoids, which are up near our shoulders at the front here. So these are my deltoids up here. Then we've got pectorals, which are in our chest. You've got biceps on the top of your arm. So if you're really strong, this is going to be so embarrassing. You can do that and you can see hopefully you can see my muscle line. If you can't, I'll be very embarrassed. And then your triceps are what sits underneath your biceps, and they work as a pair. You've got your abdominals in front of your tummy. So if you've ever done a sit-up and hurt afterwards, that's your abdominals. Your quadriceps are the ones on the front of your legs. So these are my quadriceps. Then on the back of you, the big muscle on your back, underneath your neck, that's what's called your trapezius, and it's called that because it's shaped like a trapezius. We've talked about the triceps being under the arms, under the biceps. Your latissimus dorsi, these are the ones down your sides, okay? So they're not really at the front, well, they're more at the back, but they go down the side of your body. Your gluteus maximus, or your gluteals, is your butt. Then you've got your hamstrings, which are behind your quads. So these are my quads, these are my hamstrings. And then your gastrocnemius, which is a fun word to say, is your calf muscle. So that's behind your lower leg. And behind your gastrocnemius sits your soleus. So when you touch the back of your calf, you're mostly touching your gastrocnemius or your calf. Underneath that, you've got your soleus muscle. Most people forget about the soleus because they only think about the gastrocnemius. And finally, you've got your masseter muscle, and that's the one that sits on your mandible and helps you open and close your jaw and helps you talk to people on Zoom, okay? That's really important if you like to eat or talk like me. Now, muscle contraction. Describe the process that causes a muscle to contract. This is quite a complex process, and I'm a little bit surprised that we need to know as much as we do for this honor. So I can't go through it online because it is quite complex, but I found a really awesome video that takes you through step by step, and you can write those steps down in your worksheet. So not only are we running out of time, but also it is just a bit too complicated to cover on a Zoom call. So go away, watch the video. You can pause it, you can rewind it, you can write the steps down as you're going, whatever works best for you. You can find diagrams on Google, but take some time and go through that slowly, because if I run through it quickly now, it probably won't make sense, and you'll need to go back and do it anyway. So that's a task for you for after this session. Now, we've talked about voluntary and involuntary muscles already. Remember, we can't control our heart beating, that our body does that for us, whereas we can move our arms up and down. So this is just a recap. Remember that voluntary muscles, like we said, skeletal muscles are attached to the skeletal frame, and they're generally under our control. So biceps, triceps, quads, hamstrings, that kind of thing. Most involuntary muscles are organs: heart, intestine, liver, kidney, stomach, bladder, all those things. Bladder actually is semi-voluntary, but anyway, most are organs that are controlled by what's called the autonomic system without our conscious control. So essentially, under our conscious control, not under our conscious control. And it's really important actually that we can't control our involuntary muscles, otherwise we would never ever get anything done. So remember, for question 9, you had to go away and build a model. Well, what you will need to do with that model is show how the bones, the joints, and the muscles all work together to produce movement. So you had to make a model to show a joint with 2 or more bones. You'll need to now add some muscles into that model so that you can show how all of them work together to facilitate movement. That's a fun activity, I think. I kind of want to do that after the session. And what you've also got to do after the session is find 3 texts in the Bible that mention bones or muscles. Then you've got to describe the meaning of each text in your own words. There are loads in the Bible, so I would challenge you. I'm not going to give you any clues because I found loads when I was doing my research. Go away, have a look. If you're struggling, maybe drop a message into the comments on the BUC Youth page, and you can share some thoughts with some other people, but there are loads. So I'm really hoping you'll be able to find some that make sense for you.